November 7th, 1942. Sidi Bouzid, Tunisia. First Lieutenant William Westmoreland crouched behind a shattered stone wall, watching a German Mark IV tank grind toward his position across the rocky terrain. The tank's long 75mm gun traversed slowly, searching for targets among the scattered American infantry. Westmoreland's men, fresh troops from the 1st Infantry Division experiencing their first taste of combat against the Afrika Korps, had already seen 3 of their M3 Stuart light tanks reduced to burning hulls. The German armour seemed unstoppable. Then, from a fold in the ground 30 yards to Westmoreland's left, Private Robert Patterson stood up with what looked like a length of stovepipe balanced on his shoulder. The weapon was crude, almost comical in appearance. A simple metal tube, 5 feet long, with basic iron sights and a wooden stock. Patterson aimed at the approaching Mark IV, squeezed the trigger mechanism, and a rocket motor, ignited with a whoosh that sounded more like fireworks than serious ordnance. The 2.36-inch rocket streaked toward the tank, trailing white smoke. It struck the Mark IV's frontal armour and detonated with a sharp crack. The tank stopped, smoke pouring from its engine deck. The crew bailed out, abandoning their vehicle. Westmoreland stared in disbelief. A weapon that weighed just 13 pounds had stopped a 30-ton tank. The Germans had been bragging about their Panzer's invincibility. American commanders had been wringing their hands about inadequate anti-tank weapons. And here was a glorified tube that any soldier could carry, requiring no complex training, no heavy equipment, no elaborate logistics, just a tube, a rocket, and steady nerves. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What Lieutenant Westmoreland did not know that morning in Tunisia was that the crude weapon Patterson had just fired, dismissed by many ordnance experts as too weak to be effective, would become one of the most important infantry weapons of the Second World War. 3 years later, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower would list it among just 4 weapons that had been absolutely critical to Allied victory. The bazooka, a weapon whose very name came from a comedian's musical instrument, a weapon that weapons experts had nearly cancelled multiple times, a weapon that looked like something a farmer might cobble together in a barn. And yet, it would fundamentally alter infantry tactics, level the battlefield between foot soldiers and armoured vehicles, and prove that sometimes the simplest solution is the most revolutionary. The story begins not in 1942, but in the previous decade, when the United States Army faced a problem that seemed impossible to solve. How does an infantry soldier, carrying only what he can shoulder, stop a tank? The question haunted military planners throughout the 1930s as European nations rearmed and tank development accelerated. The Spanish Civil War, from 1936 to 1939, had demonstrated modern armour's devastating effectiveness against conventional infantry. Republican and nationalist forces both deployed tanks, and foot soldiers on both sides found themselves helpless against steel armour. The British, French, and Germans all worked on solutions. The British developed the Boys anti-tank rifle, a monster of a weapon weighing 36 pounds and firing a half-inch armour-piercing round. The recoil was so brutal that it dislocated shoulders and broke collarbones. The penetration was adequate against early 1930s tanks, but already obsolete by 1938 as armour thickness increased. The Germans developed the Panzer anti-tank rifle, similarly heavy and similarly ineffective against modern armour. The French experimented with various rifle grenades and shaped charges, achieving modest results but requiring soldiers to approach dangerously close to enemy tanks. The fundamental problem was physics. Conventional bullets, even large-caliber armour-piercing bullets, lost effectiveness as armour thickness increased. To penetrate thicker armour required either larger projectiles, fired from heavier weapons, or entirely new approaches to defeating armour. Heavy anti-tank guns worked, but they required trucks or tractors to move them, crews of 6 to 8 men to operate them, and complex logistics to keep them supplied with ammunition. They could not accompany infantry into rough terrain. They could not be repositioned quickly. They were vulnerable to enemy artillery and air attack. What infantry commanders wanted seemed impossible. A weapon light enough for one man to carry, Simple enough to require minimal training, powerful enough to destroy tanks, cheap enough to mass produce, available immediately. The weapon, everyone said, could not exist. Enter Captain Leslie Skinner and Lieutenant Edward Uhl. Neither man was a famous weapons designer. Neither had worked for major ordnance manufacturers. Skinner was an Army Reserve officer called to active duty, assigned to the Ordnance Department's Research and Development Service. Uhl was a young lieutenant with an engineering degree from Lehigh University. Both men worked at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, where the Army tested new weapons and equipment. In May of 1942, Skinner and Uhl were studying a recent development from Swiss ordnance engineer Henry Mohaupt. Mohaupt had perfected the shaped charge, also called the Munro effect or hollow charge. The principle was devastatingly elegant. A high explosive charge with a cone-shaped cavity lined with metal, when detonated, converted the metal lining into a superheated jet moving at over 20,000 feet per second. This jet could penetrate steel armor far thicker than conventional explosives could breach. The shaped charge was not new. The Munro effect had been documented since 1888, but Mohaupt had refined it, creating reliable designs that could be manufactured consistently. The problem was delivery. How do you get a shaped charge close enough to a tank to be effective? Rifle grenades had limited range and accuracy. Artillery shells could deliver shaped charges, but artillery was not always available when infantry encountered tanks. Skinner and Uhl knew that the Army was desperately searching for an infantry anti-tank solution. American troops were about to deploy to combat zones in North Africa. German panzers had swept across France in 1940. They were driving deep into the Soviet Union. American infantry needed something, anything, to fight back against armor. The two men began experimenting with a radical concept. What if you attached a small rocket motor to a shaped charge? The rocket would provide propulsion without requiring a complex gun mechanism. The whole assembly could be fired from a simple tube. One man could carry it. Any soldier could learn to operate it. The concept was so simple it seemed absurd. Military weapons were supposed to be precision instruments, carefully engineered with tight tolerances. This was just a tube and a rocket. But Skinner and Uhl had learned an important lesson from studying rushed wartime weapon development. Perfect was the enemy of good enough. The war would not wait for elegant solutions. In early June of 1942, working in a small laboratory at Aberdeen, the two men constructed their first prototype. They took a length of steel tubing, added basic sights, attached a simple electrical firing mechanism, and mounted it on a rudimentary shoulder stock. The rocket itself used an M10-shaped charge warhead connected to a small rocket motor. The motor burned for just 1/10 of a second, but that was enough to accelerate the projectile to over 200 feet per second. On June 14, 1942, they conducted their first test firing. The location was a remote corner of the Aberdeen Proving Ground. No senior officers attended. No official observers witnessed the shot, just Skinner, Uhl, and a few enlisted men helping with the test setup. They mounted the prototype on a simple wooden stand, aimed it at a target 50 yards away, connected the electrical firing circuit, and retreated behind a protective barrier. Uhl pressed the firing button. The rocket motor ignited with a sharp crack and a cloud of white smoke. The projectile streaked toward the target, wobbling slightly but maintaining its trajectory. It struck the steel plate target and detonated. When the smoke cleared, they examined the results. A hole. Not a dent, not a crack, but a clean puncture through 3 inches of armor plate. 3 inches. The German Mark IV tank, backbone of the Afrika Corps, had frontal armor just 2 inches thick. This crude prototype could defeat it. The two men looked at each other, understanding immediately what they had created. They had solved the impossible problem. Within days, Skinner and Uhl presented their weapon to Colonel Leslie Simon, chief of the Research and Development Service. Simon was skeptical. The weapon looked ridiculous. It was just a tube. Where were the complex mechanisms? Where was the precision engineering? Where were the expensive components that characterized real military hardware? Skinner and Uhl demonstrated the weapon, firing several shots at armor targets. Each shot penetrated. Each shot proved the concept worked. Simon remained skeptical but recognized potential. He authorized limited production of prototype units for field testing. The weapon needed a name. Officially, it was designated the rocket launcher, M1. But soldiers immediately noticed its resemblance to a bizarre musical instrument played by radio comedian Bob Burns. Burns played a contraption he called a bazooka, made from 2 gas pipes and a whiskey funnel, which produced a distinctive wheezing sound. The rocket launcher looked enough like Burns's instrument that troops started calling it the Bazooka. The name stuck, becoming one of the most famous weapon names in history. Production began in July of 1942 at the General Electric plant in Bridgeport, Connecticut. The Army ordered 5,000 units for immediate delivery. The simplicity of the design allowed for rapid manufacturing. No complex machining was required. No precision parts needed. Just steel tubing, basic electrical components, and simple sights. By September, the first bazookas reached units preparing for Operation Torch, the invasion of French North Africa, but not everyone believed in the new weapon. Ordnance traditionalists argued it was too crude to be effective in real combat. Artillery officers said it was unnecessary because anti-tank guns could already destroy tanks. Infantry officers worried about the backblast, which could reveal firing positions to enemy observers. Tank commanders questioned whether shaped charges could reliably penetrate modern armor. The debate raged through military channels as American forces prepared for their first major operation against German forces. The real test would come not in proving grounds or conference rooms, but on the battlefields of North Africa, where American infantry would face the Afrika Korps veteran Panzer units. The critics would soon discover whether this crude tube could actually change the nature of infantry combat, or whether it was just another desperate improvisation that would fail when it mattered most. November 8, 1942. Operation Torch began with 3 simultaneous amphibious landings. Western Task Force landed at Casablanca in Morocco. Central Task Force landed at Oran in Algeria. Eastern Task Force landed at Algiers. The initial opposition came from Vichy French forces, who resisted with varying degrees of intensity. French resistance collapsed within days, and American forces pushed eastward into Tunisia, where they would encounter German and Italian troops for the first time. The bazooka had been distributed to frontline infantry units, but most soldiers had received minimal training. Many had never fired the weapon. Many had never even seen one before reaching North Africa. The instruction was rudimentary. Point the tube at the tank. Press the trigger. Hope the rocket flies straight. This was the weapon that was supposed to stop German panzers. The first significant armoured engagement came in mid-November near Medjez el Bab. Elements of the 1st Infantry Division encountered German Mark III and Mark IV tanks supporting a counterattack. American M3 Stuart light tanks attempted to engage but were outgunned. The German 75mm guns could destroy Stuarts at ranges where American 37mm guns could barely scratch German armour. The American tanks retreated, leaving infantry exposed to the advancing panzers. Private First Class John Morrison, a rifleman from Chicago who had worked in a steel mill before the war, grabbed one of the bazookas his squad had been issued. He had fired exactly 2 practice rounds back at the staging area in Algeria. His loader, Private Anthony Benedetto, a kid from Queens who would later become famous as singer Tony Bennett, had never loaded the weapon before. Morrison positioned himself behind a low stone wall as a Mark IV ground toward his position. The tank was moving slowly, its commander apparently unaware of the threat. At 75 yards, Morrison aimed at the tank's side armour, steadied the tube, and fired. The rocket left the tube with the distinctive whoosh that would become legendary. It struck the tank just below the turret ring and detonated. The Mark IV stopped dead, smoke billowing from hatches. The crew evacuated, running back toward German lines. Morrison and Benedetto stared at their crude weapon in amazement. It had actually worked. Word spread quickly through the battalion. The bazooka could kill tanks. The psychological impact was immediate. American infantry, who had been dreading encounters with German armor, suddenly had a weapon that gave them a fighting chance. The bazooka could not guarantee victory, but it provided hope, and hope matters in combat. Throughout late November and December of 1942, American forces learned hard lessons in Tunisia. The Afrika Korps was experienced, well-equipped, and expertly led. American units suffered defeats at Tiborba, Longstop Hill, and across the Kasserine Pass approaches. But the bazooka consistently proved its value. When American infantry held position and engaged German tanks with bazookas, the Panzers stopped or withdrew. The weapon was not perfect. The M1 rocket had accuracy problems beyond 150 yards. The shaped charge occasionally failed to detonate properly. The electrical firing mechanism was vulnerable to moisture and dirt. Soldiers discovered that the backblast was significant, creating a huge plume of white smoke that immediately revealed their position to enemy troops. But despite these limitations, the bazooka worked. And in war, a weapon that works adequately is infinitely better than no weapon at all. The Germans took immediate notice. Afrika Korps intelligence units recovered several bazookas from destroyed American positions and shipped them back to Germany for analysis. Ordnance engineers in Berlin examined the captured weapons with fascination and disbelief. The construction was almost primitive: steel tubing, simple sights, basic electrical firing, no complex mechanisms, no precision engineering. Yet the weapons effectively defeated tank armor. This contradicted everything German weapons designers believed about proper military engineering. The German response revealed much about their military philosophy versus American pragmatism. Rather than copying the bazooka's simple design, German engineers set out to improve it, to make it properly German. The result was the Panzer Schreck, or tank terror, introduced in late 1943. The Panzer Schreck fired a larger 88mm rocket with better penetration than the American 2.36-inch round. But the German weapon weighed nearly 25 pounds, compared to the bazooka's 13 pounds. It required a blast shield to protect the operator from backblast. It was more expensive to manufacture. It was harder to maintain in field conditions. The Germans had made the bazooka better, but in doing so, they had lost what made it revolutionary. The American weapon was good enough and simple enough to arm every infantry squad. The German weapon was superior, but too complex to produce in sufficient numbers. This pattern of German over-engineering versus American pragmatic mass production would repeat throughout the war. But before German copies reached the field, American forces faced their greatest test with the original weapon. February 19, 1943. Kasserine Pass. February 14, 1943. Kasserine Pass. The name would become synonymous with American defeat, the lowest point of the North African campaign. But within that defeat, the bazooka would prove its worth in ways that would reshape Allied infantry doctrine for the remainder of the war. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox himself, had conceived a bold plan. His Afrika Korps and Italian forces would strike through the Kasserine Pass in Tunisia's western dorsal mountains, split American and British forces, and potentially drive all the way to the supply depots at Tebessa in Algeria. The attack would employ the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions, veteran formations that had fought across North Africa for 2 years. Against them stood elements of the 1st Armoured Division and 34th Infantry Division, units that had been in combat for less than 3 months. The German assault began on February 14th. Panzer columns smashed through American forward positions. Inexperienced American units broke under the combined arms assault of tanks, artillery, and infantry. By February 20th, German forces had driven 15 miles through the pass and were threatening to break into the open terrain beyond. The situation was desperate. General Lloyd Fredendall, commanding 2nd Corps, issued orders for a fighting withdrawal. American units would trade space for time, inflicting maximum casualties while falling back to more defensible positions. This was where the bazooka earned its reputation. In the chaos of retreat, with command and control breaking down, With artillery positions overrun and tank units scattered, infantry squads found themselves alone facing German armour. They had rifles, grenades, machine guns, and bazookas. Nothing else. Sergeant William Chapman's squad, from the 16th Infantry, Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, occupied a position overlooking a narrow valley through which German tanks had to pass to exploit their breakthrough. Chapman had 7 men, 2 bazookas, and ammunition for perhaps 10 shots total. No radio, no support weapons, no hope of reinforcement. The German column appeared at dawn on February 20th. 8 Mark IV tanks, 2 Mark III tanks, and several half-tracks carrying Panzer Grenadier infantry. The column moved confidently, engines roaring, commanders standing in their turrets. They had broken through American lines repeatedly over the past 5 days. They expected only scattered resistance. Chapman positioned his 2 bazooka teams on opposite sides of the valley, roughly 200 yards apart. The plan was simple. Let the column enter the kill zone. Hit the lead tank. Hit the rear tank. Trap the column. Then hit everything in between. At 100 yards, Private Harold Garman fired first. His rocket struck the lead Mark IV on its right track, shattering the drive sprocket. The tank lurched to a halt, blocking the narrow trail. Before the German crews could react, Corporal James Peterson fired at the last vehicle in the column, another Mark IV. His rocket penetrated the engine deck. Smoke and flames erupted from the tank. The column was trapped. Garman and Peterson reloaded and fired again, hitting tanks in the middle of the column. The valley filled with smoke and dust. German tankers, realizing they were under effective anti-tank fire, began backing their vehicles, trying to escape the kill zone. Chapman's riflemen opened fire on the exposed Panzer Grenadiers, who had dismounted from their half-tracks and were attempting to locate the American positions. For 15 minutes, Chapman's 7 men held off an entire German column. They destroyed or disabled 4 tanks and killed or wounded dozens of infantry. Then, German mortars found their positions, and Chapman ordered withdrawal. His squad had delayed the German advance for nearly an hour and proven what properly employed bazookas could accomplish. Similar small unit actions occurred throughout the Kasserine fighting. American infantry, often cut off and surrounded, used bazookas to defend themselves against armour that would otherwise have annihilated them. The weapon could not stop the German offensive, but it made that offensive far more costly than Rommel had anticipated. By February 22nd, Rommel realized he could not achieve his objectives. American resistance had stiffened. British forces were moving to cut off his advance. His tanks had suffered unexpected losses to infantry anti-tank weapons. He ordered withdrawal back through the Kasserine Pass. American forces had been defeated, driven back 20 miles, lost thousands of casualties. But they had not been destroyed. They had learned lessons, and one of those lessons was that the bazooka, properly employed, could stop tanks. General George Patton, who took command of 2nd Corps on March 6, 1943, made the bazooka a priority in his rebuilding efforts. He demanded that every infantry squad train extensively with the weapon. He insisted on aggressive anti-tank tactics. He wanted infantry to hunt tanks, not hide from them. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The bazooka's performance in Tunisia led to immediate improvements. The M1A1 variant, introduced in March 1943, added a conical wire mesh blast deflector around the rear of the tube. This deflector directed the rocket's backblast away from the operator's face, reducing the smoke and flash that revealed firing positions. The improvement seemed minor, but it significantly enhanced survivability. Soldiers were willing to fire from closer ranges when they knew the backblast would not blind or burn them. The M9 rocket, also introduced in early 1943, improved reliability and accuracy. The shaped charge warhead was refined for more consistent penetration. The rocket motor burn was extended slightly, improving velocity and range. These incremental improvements transformed the bazooka from a desperate improvisation into a genuinely effective weapon system. By summer of 1943, when Allied forces prepared to invade Sicily, every American infantry company had multiple bazooka teams, trained and ready. The Sicily campaign, beginning July 10, 1943, demonstrated the bazooka's versatility beyond pure anti-tank work. American forces encountered German pillboxes, concrete bunkers, and fortified buildings. Conventional methods of attacking these positions required tanks, artillery, or engineers with demolition charges. But bazookas could breach walls, destroy bunkers, and collapse buildings from ranges where riflemen could provide covering fire. The shaped charge warhead, designed to penetrate tank armor, proved equally effective against concrete and masonry. Paratroopers particularly valued the bazooka. The 82nd Airborne Division, jumping into Sicily ahead of the amphibious landings, carried bazookas as their primary heavy weapon. Broken down into two pieces, the tube and the launch mechanism, a bazooka could be carried by parachute and quickly assembled on the ground. For lightly armed airborne troops, this provided firepower that could defeat tanks, destroy bunkers, and support assaults. Without bazookas, paratroopers would have been almost helpless against armor. Lieutenant Colonel James Gavin, commanding the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment during the Sicily jump, later wrote that bazookas saved his regiment from destruction on multiple occasions. When German Tiger tanks attacked their positions near Piano Lupo on July 11th, bazooka teams engaged from close range, forcing the Tigers to withdraw. The rockets probably did not penetrate Tiger's massive armor, but the explosions damaged vision ports, disabled tracks, and convinced German commanders that continuing the attack was too costly. Gavin noted that the psychological impact of the bazooka often exceeded its actual destructive power. Tank crews who believed enemy infantry had effective anti-tank weapons fought more cautiously, advancing more slowly, supporting each other more carefully. This caution reduced the effectiveness of armor even when the bazookas did not achieve kills. The Italian campaign, beginning with the Salerno landings in September 1943 and continuing up the peninsula for nearly 2 years, became a bazooka proving ground. The mountainous terrain, narrow roads, and countless river crossings favored defense. German forces established position after position, using armor to support infantry and seal off breakthrough attempts. American infantry advanced yard by yard, using bazookas to destroy tanks, bunkers, and strongpoints. The past fighting was brutal, slow, grinding attrition, but the bazooka consistently proved its value in close-quarter fighting, where artillery could not reach and tanks could not maneuver. Monte Cassino, the 4-month battle from January to May 1944 that cost 55,000 Allied casualties, saw intensive bazooka use in urban combat. American and Allied troops fought through the rubble of the monastery and town, clearing buildings room by room. Bazookas breached walls, allowing assault teams to enter buildings from unexpected directions. They destroyed machine gun positions that had pinned down entire companies. They collapsed floors, bringing down snipers in upper stories. The weapon had become indispensable for infantry combat in any terrain, but the ultimate test was still to come. June 6, 1944, D-Day. The invasion of Normandy would be the largest amphibious operation in history, putting more than 150,000 Allied troops ashore on 5 beaches along the Norman coast. Those troops would face German defenders who had spent years preparing defensive positions, and they would face German tanks. The 21st Panzer Division was positioned just inland from the beaches. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Youth was in reserve nearby. Additional panzer divisions were scattered across France, ready to counterattack any landing. American planners knew that infantry coming ashore would be vulnerable to armored counterattacks. They could not rely on tanks or tank destroyers to be available immediately. Naval gunfire could support beaches but could not reach far inland. Artillery would take hours or days to establish firing positions. Infantry would be alone, and infantry needed weapons that could stop panzers. The bazooka was the answer. Every assault company carried multiple bazooka teams ashore. The weapon was considered so critical that special waterproofing measures were taken to ensure bazookas could function, even after being submerged during the landing. The 29th Infantry Division, landing on Omaha Beach, carried bazookas sealed in waterproof bags. The 4th Infantry Division, landing on Utah Beach, issued bazookas to lead assault elements with orders to engage any armor immediately. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, dropping inland during the night before the invasion, carried dozens of bazookas, despite severe weight restrictions on what paratroopers could carry. The decision to prioritize bazookas over other equipment reflected how essential the weapon had become. German counterattacks began within hours of the landings. At Omaha Beach, elements of the 916th Regiment, defending the bluffs above the beach, called for armor support. Several assault guns and tank destroyers moved toward American positions. Bazooka teams from the 1st and 29th Divisions engaged, knocking out or damaging multiple vehicles. The German armor withdrew, unable to reach the beach exits that were critical for the American breakout. At Utah Beach, 4th Infantry Division troops encountered German tanks near Sainte-Mère-Église. Bazooka fire disabled the lead tank, blocking the road and forcing the German column to withdraw. The airborne operations demonstrated the bazooka's importance even more dramatically. Paratroopers from both American airborne divisions were scattered across the Norman countryside, landing miles from their intended drop zones. Small groups of men, often just a few soldiers from different units, found themselves alone behind German lines. When they encountered German patrols or armor, bazookas provided the only heavy firepower available. Private John Steele, whose parachute caught on the church steeple at Sainte-Mère-Église in one of D-Day's most famous incidents, later recounted watching isolated bazooka teams ambush German convoys throughout the night of June 6th and 7th. Each ambush delayed, German reinforcements trying to reach the beaches. Each delay gave Allied forces more time to consolidate their positions. The hedgerow fighting in Normandy from June through July 1944 became a bazooka war. The bocage, Norman farmland divided by centuries-old hedgerows, was ideal defensive terrain. Each field was a separate fortress, bounded by earthen banks topped with dense vegetation. Roads were narrow lanes between high hedgerows, perfect ambush sites. German defenders positioned machine guns, mortars, and anti-tank guns to cover every approach. American infantry advancing across this terrain faced fire from three sides every time they entered a field. Tanks that entered the narrow lanes found themselves channeled and vulnerable. Bazookas became essential for suppressing German positions. Infantry could not cross open fields under machine gun fire, but bazooka teams could move along hedgerows, concealed from observation, and engage German positions with devastating fire. The shaped charge warheads exploded against hedgerow banks, creating shrapnel that swept German positions. They detonated against buildings, collapsing walls, and forcing defenders to withdraw. They destroyed tanks foolish enough to advance without infantry support. The weapon that had been designed to stop armor had evolved into a general-purpose assault weapon. Sergeant Curtis Culin, a tanker in the 2nd Armored Division, invented the famous rhinoceros hedgerow cutter by welding steel teeth to tank hulls, allowing Shermans to crash through hedgerows instead of climbing over them. His invention revolutionized armored warfare in the bocage, but infantry supporting those tanks carried bazookas, ready to engage any German armor that counterattacked. The combination of mobile tanks and infantry with effective anti-tank weapons finally broke the hedgerow stalemate in late July during Operation Cobra. By August 1944, as Allied forces broke out from Normandy and raced across France, the bazooka had become standard infantry equipment, as common as rifles or machine guns. Production had reached tens of thousands per month. Improved versions continued to appear, each addressing problems identified in combat. The M9 bazooka, introduced in summer of 1944, used aluminum alloy instead of steel for the tube, reducing weight from 13 pounds to just 11 pounds. This seemingly small improvement made a significant difference for soldiers who carried the weapon all day. The M9 also broke down into two pieces that could be carried separately and assembled in seconds, making it easier to transport and conceal. The M6A3 rocket, the standard ammunition by late 1944, could penetrate up to 4 inches of armor at 90-degree impact angle. This was sufficient to defeat the side and rear armor of any German tank except the King Tiger. Even against Tigers and Panthers, with their thick frontal armor, flank shots could achieve kills. Infantry learned to work in teams, using some soldiers to suppress enemy infantry with rifle fire, while bazooka teams maneuvered for side shots on tanks. These tactics, developed through hard experience, made American infantry among the most effective anti-tank forces in the world. The German winter offensive in the Ardennes, beginning December 16, 1944, provided the ultimate test of American infantry and their weapons. 3 German armies, spearheaded by elite SS Panzer divisions, smashed through thinly held American lines in Belgium and Luxembourg. The weather was terrible, fog and snow grounding Allied aircraft. German armor advanced rapidly, creating pockets of surrounded American troops throughout the Ardennes forest. The siege of Bastogne became the most famous of these encirclements, but dozens of smaller groups found themselves cut off and surrounded. The 101st Airborne Division, holding Bastogne, relied heavily on bazookas to defend against German armor. The division had been rushed to Bastogne without proper winter equipment, without adequate ammunition, without tank or artillery support. What they had were rifles, machine guns, and bazookas. When Panzer Lehr Division and the 2nd Panzer Division attempted to take the town, bazooka teams positioned throughout the American perimeter engaged at close range. The urban terrain forced German tanks to advance slowly, exposing them to flank shots. Private First Class Richard Winters, later famous for his service with Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, described watching bazooka teams work in pairs during the Bastogne fighting. One team would fire at a tank's frontal armor, not expecting to penetrate but forcing the crew to button up and lose visibility. While the tank commander focused on the threat from his front, the second team would move to the flank and fire into the thinner side armor. This tactic required extraordinary courage, as the bazooka teams had to expose themselves to enemy fire, but it worked repeatedly. The relief of Bastogne by elements of 3rd Army on December 26th ended the siege, but fighting in the Ardennes continued through January 1945. Throughout this month-long battle, bazookas accounted for hundreds of German armoured vehicle kills. Exact numbers are impossible to determine, as many vehicles were hit by multiple weapons, and credit is unclear. But after-action reports consistently mention bazooka teams engaging and destroying German armor under the worst possible conditions: extreme cold, deep snow, fog, and overwhelming enemy numbers. General Anthony McAuliffe, commanding the 101st at Bastogne, later stated that without bazookas, his division could not have held the town. Artillery and air support eventually arrived, but during the critical first week, infantry weapons were all he had. The bazooka made the difference between holding and being overrun. The psychological effect on German troops was significant. Panzer crews had been told they were facing demoralized, defeated Americans who would collapse under determined attack. Instead, they encountered infantry, who stood and fought, who had weapons that could kill tanks, who refused to surrender even when surrounded. The German offensive failed not because of superior Allied numbers or equipment, at least not initially, but because American infantry refused to break. And they refused to break partly because they had weapons that gave them a fighting chance. By early 1945, as Allied forces crossed the Rhine and advanced into Germany itself, bazooka tactics had been refined to near perfection. Infantry moved through German cities using bazookas to breach walls and destroy strongpoints. Tank infantry teams worked together seamlessly, with bazookas protecting tanks from Panzerfaust-armed German infantry, while tanks provided mobile fire support. The weapon that had seemed so crude in 1942 had become a sophisticated tool in the hands of experienced soldiers. The final battles in Germany saw bazookas used in every role imaginable. They destroyed the last Tiger and Panther tanks still defending German cities. They breached the fortifications of the Siegfried Line. They collapsed buildings sheltering SS holdouts. They provided covering fire for river crossings. They supported urban combat in Berlin and dozens of smaller cities. The versatility that had emerged during 4 years of combat meant that infantry could employ bazookas for virtually any task requiring explosive force delivered precisely. The Pacific Theatre told a different story, but one equally important to understanding the bazooka's impact. Japanese forces used tanks less extensively than German forces, but when they did deploy armor, American infantry needed weapons to counter them. The M4 Sherman tank could easily defeat any Japanese tank in direct combat, but Shermans could not. Go everywhere infantry went. On jungle islands, in dense vegetation, across rough terrain, infantry often fought without armor support. Bazookas provided that support. More importantly, in the Pacific, bazookas proved devastating against Japanese fortifications. Japanese defenders on islands like Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa constructed elaborate bunker systems, concrete pillboxes, steel-reinforced blockhouses, cave positions dug deep into coral or volcanic rock. These fortifications were designed to withstand naval bombardment and artillery fire. They could only be reduced by direct assault, and direct assault against prepared positions cost terrible casualties. Bazookas changed the calculus. Marine and Army infantry could approach a bunker, sometimes crawling within 20 or 30 yards, and fire rockets directly into firing slits or doorways. The shaped charge warheads detonated inside the fortifications, killing defenders and destroying weapons. This tactic required enormous courage, as the soldiers firing had to expose themselves to enemy fire. But it worked, and it saved lives compared to alternatives like flamethrowers or satchel charges that required even closer approach. Iwo Jima, February through March 1945, saw intensive bazooka use against Japanese cave positions. The island's volcanic rock allowed Japanese engineers to create extensive underground fortifications. Marines advancing across Iwo faced fire from positions they could not see, connected by tunnels that allowed defenders to relocate and reappear in different locations. Bazookas became the primary weapon for reducing these positions. Marine infantry would fix a Japanese position with rifle fire, then bazooka teams would advance and fire multiple rockets into cave entrances, collapsing the openings or killing defenders inside. Okinawa, April through June 1945, repeated the pattern on a larger scale. Japanese forces defended in depth, using the island's rugged terrain to create defensive lines that required weeks to break through. Bazookas supported every major attack, destroying bunkers, breaching walls, and providing fire support where artillery could not reach. The weapon designed to stop tanks in North Africa had evolved into the infantry's universal problem solver in the Pacific. When General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, sat down after the war to reflect on the weapons that had been most critical to Allied victory, he identified 4 as absolutely essential. The C-47 transport aircraft, which provided mobility and logistics. The Jeep, which provided tactical mobility for troops and supplies. The 2.5-ton truck, which provided operational and strategic logistics. And the bazooka, which provided infantry with the ability to fight armor and fortifications. This assessment surprised many observers. Eisenhower did not mention bombers or fighters. He did not mention battleships or carriers. He did not mention artillery or tanks. He mentioned logistics and infantry weapons, the tools that allowed armies to move, fight, and survive. The bazooka's inclusion in this list validated everything Captain Leslie Skinner and Lieutenant Edward Ewell had believed in 1942. Their crude prototype, dismissed by experts, had become one of the 4 weapons that won the war. The reasoning behind Eisenhower's assessment became clear when analyzed. The bazooka had fundamentally changed infantry combat. Before the bazooka, infantry facing tanks had 3 options: retreat, die, or hope friendly tanks or anti-tank guns were nearby. After the bazooka, infantry could stand and fight. This changed tactics, strategy, and the psychological balance of combat. Infantry that could defend against armor could hold positions that previously would have been untenable. They could operate in terrain where tanks could not follow. They could assault fortifications without waiting for heavy weapons support. This flexibility allowed commanders to employ infantry more aggressively, knowing they had tools to deal with unexpected threats. The strategic impact multiplied across armies of millions. The United States produced approximately 490,000 bazookas during World War II. Millions of rockets were manufactured. Every American infantry division, every airborne division, every Marine division carried hundreds of bazookas. Allied nations received tens of thousands through Lend-Lease. British forces used bazookas extensively. Soviet forces received bazookas and developed their own versions. The weapon's simplicity meant it could be manufactured quickly and cheaply. A bazooka cost approximately $16 to produce in 1944. A single M4 Sherman tank cost $44,000. For the price of one tank, the United States could equip nearly 3,000 infantry with bazookas. This economic efficiency mattered enormously in a war where industrial production determined outcomes. The bazooka multiplied infantry effectiveness at minimal cost, allowing more resources to be devoted to other weapons systems. The training requirements were equally minimal. A soldier could learn basic bazooka operation in a few hours. Achieving proficiency took longer, but the fundamental skills were simple enough that replacement troops could be combat-ready quickly. This was critical in a war where divisions suffered continuous casualties and needed constant replacement. Complex weapons requiring extensive training created bottlenecks. Simple weapons like the bazooka allowed rapid regeneration of combat power. The legacy extended far beyond World War II. The bazooka established the pattern for all subsequent man-portable anti-tank weapons. The Soviet RPG-7, introduced in 1961 and still in use worldwide today, is a direct descendant of the bazooka concept. The Swedish Carl Gustaf, the American M72 La, the British NLA, the American Javelin, all follow the same basic principle: a man-portable tube firing a rocket-propelled shaped charge. The details have evolved dramatically, with modern weapons featuring guided missiles, tandem warheads to defeat reactive armor, and sophisticated fire control systems. But the core concept remains unchanged from what Skinner and Uhl created in June 1942. The bazooka also influenced anti-tank tactics that remain current. The concept of infantry working in teams to engage armor, using terrain and concealment to achieve close-range flank shots, suppressing enemy infantry to protect anti-tank teams, all of these tactics were developed by American infantry using bazookas. Modern armies still train these same tactics, adapted for newer weapons but fundamentally unchanged. The psychological aspect proved equally enduring. Infantry with effective anti-tank weapons fight differently than infantry without them. They are more willing to hold positions, more aggressive in assault, more confident in defense. This psychological effect, identified by commanders in World War II, has been confirmed in every subsequent conflict. The mere presence of anti-tank weapons, even if not fired, changes how both sides fight. The bazooka's influence extended into popular culture in ways few weapons have achieved. The name itself became synonymous with portable rocket launchers worldwide. The weapon appeared in countless films, television shows, and books about World War II. It became an icon of American infantry, as recognizable as the M1 Garand rifle or the steel helmet. This cultural impact reflected the weapon's importance to the soldiers who carried it and the public who saw it as a symbol of American innovation and fighting spirit. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.